The prison built to disappear people. Some prisons lock people away. One prison was designed to make them vanish. A steel door slammed shut. Then another. Then another. The sound echoed through a concrete hallway deep inside a prison hidden among the mountains of Southwest Virginia. A correctional officer stopped outside a cell and looked through a narrow window. Inside sat a man alone. No television. No conversation. No human contact. Just gray concrete, silence, and time. The inmate had spent years inside that small space. Years without touching another person. Years without walking freely across a room larger than a parking space. Years watching the same walls. Years hearing the same doors. For some men, that silence became worse than the sentence itself. And that was exactly the point. This was not an ordinary prison. This was Red Onion State Prison, one of the most restrictive prisons in America. A place where isolation became a way of life. A place where many inmates said the real punishment began after the cell door closed. But how did a prison like this come to exist? And what really happens behind those concrete walls? To understand Red Onion, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to a time when America believed its prisons had a growing problem. During the 1980s and 1990s, prison violence became a major concern across the country. Officials worried about gang activity. They worried about assaults. They worried about inmates who continued to influence criminal organizations even while locked up. Many prison systems began searching for a solution. The answer they chose was simple. Separate the most difficult inmates from everyone else. Remove contact. Remove influence. Remove opportunity. The idea eventually led to the rise of Supermax prisons. Facilities designed for maximum control. Facilities built around isolation. Facilities where every movement could be monitored. Virginia wanted one of its own. The result was Red Onion State Prison. Construction began in the rugged mountains of Wise County, Virginia. The location was remote, far from major cities, far from busy highways, far from the public eye. Many people believed that was intentional. When Red Onion opened in 1998, it quickly became known as one of the most secure prisons in the state. The prison's design focused on control. Everything inside served that purpose. The walls were thick concrete. The doors were solid steel. The cells were built to limit interaction. The schedules were strict. The routines were predictable. Every detail had been carefully planned. Officials believed structure created safety. But critics wondered whether something else was being created as well. Something harder to measure. Something that could not be seen on security cameras. Something happening inside the minds of the people locked there. As years passed, Red Onion gained a reputation. Not because of escapes. There were very few. Not because of riots. Those were rare. Instead, the prison became known for its extreme levels of isolation. Many inmates spent most of each day alone. Meals arrived through small openings in cell doors. Recreation often happened individually. Movement was tightly controlled. Officers escorted inmates through hallways using detailed security procedures. Everything followed a system. Everything followed a plan. The goal was to prevent violence before it started. Supporters argued the prison worked exactly as intended. They pointed to lower levels of inmate interaction. They pointed to improved security. They pointed to the absence of large-scale disturbances. To them, Red Onion represented control. But others saw something different. Former inmates described long periods of loneliness. Advocates raised questions about mental health. Researchers began studying what happens when people spend years separated from normal social interaction. The debate grew louder. Yet inside Red Onion, daily life continued. Every morning began almost the same way. Lights, counts, meals, security checks, doors opening, doors closing. The routine rarely changed. For officers, predictability meant safety. For inmates, predictability often meant monotony. Days blended together. Weeks blended together. Months blended together. Some prisoners marked time on calendars. Others stopped counting entirely. One former inmate later described it as living inside a world where every day looked exactly like the day before. The seasons changed outside. Inside, almost nothing changed at all. Summer felt like winter. Winter felt like spring. Time seemed frozen. The prison's location only added to the feeling. Red Onion sits among the Appalachian Mountains. The landscape around it is beautiful. Rolling hills, dense forests, wide skies. But most inmates rarely saw those views. The mountains existed only beyond the walls. Visible to some, unreachable to all. Visitors who arrived at the prison often noticed something immediately. The silence. Not complete silence. Prisons are never completely silent. There were doors, keys, announcements, footsteps. But compared to many correctional facilities, Red Onion felt different. Calmer, quieter, more controlled. Some described it as eerie. Others described it as efficient. The interpretation often depended on where someone stood. Correctional officers faced their own challenges. Working inside a Supermax facility required constant attention. Every movement mattered. Every decision mattered. Mistakes could have serious consequences. Many officers spent years adapting to the unique environment. They learned procedures. They learned routines. They learned how to operate inside a system designed around security. For some, the work became a career. For others, the pressure became difficult to manage. Life inside Red Onion affected everyone who entered the building. Not just inmates. Not just officers. Everyone. As the years passed, another question began to emerge. If isolation could control behavior, what happened after someone left isolation? Could a person spend years separated from others and then suddenly return to normal life? Could the mind adapt? Could relationships be rebuilt? Could trust return? No one seemed to have easy answers. The questions continued growing. And so did the controversy. Journalists investigated. Researchers collected data. Former inmates shared experiences. Officials defended policies. Each side believed it had evidence. Each side believed it understood the truth. Meanwhile, Red Onion remained standing. Concrete walls, steel doors, endless routines. A system operating exactly as designed, or perhaps operating too well. Then came a series of reports that caught national attention. Former inmates began describing experiences that sounded remarkably similar despite never meeting one another. They spoke about losing track of time. They spoke about struggling to concentrate. They spoke about the strange effects of prolonged isolation. The story spread. Questions followed. What was happening inside Red Onion? Was the prison protecting society? Or was something deeper unfolding behind those walls? The debate was about to become impossible to ignore. Because hidden inside official records, interviews, and years of testimony was a discovery that would force people across America to take a closer look at one of the country's most isolated prisons. And once those findings became public, the conversation about Red Onion State Prison would never be the same again. The most dangerous thing inside Red Onion wasn't violence. It was silence. The reports began quietly. A former inmate gave an interview. Then another. Then another. Different men. Different years. Different cells. Yet many described the same thing. At first, they thought the changes were temporary. A few bad days. A few difficult weeks. Nothing unusual. But then the weeks became months. The months became years. And something started happening. Not to their bodies. To their minds. Inside Red Onion, time moved differently. Outside prison walls, people measured life through events. Birthdays, holidays, family visits, conversations, work, school, relationships. Inside isolation, many of those markers disappeared. Days became nearly identical. One morning looked almost exactly like the next. The same walls, the same doors, the same routine. Again and again, some inmates said they began losing track of dates. Others stopped caring about dates entirely. One former prisoner described waking up and honestly not knowing whether it was Tuesday or Saturday. Eventually, he said, it stopped mattering. Every day felt the same. And that was when the real struggle began. Humans are social creatures. For thousands of years, people survived by living together, talking, working, sharing experiences, reading emotions, recognizing faces. But inside long-term isolation, many of those normal experiences disappear. At Red Onion, some inmates spent most of their day alone. Interaction became limited. Conversations became rare. The silence grew. For some people, the silence felt manageable at first. Then, it started changing them. Former inmates reported difficulty concentrating. Reading became harder. Memory became weaker. Simple thoughts felt more difficult to organize. Some described feeling disconnected from reality. Others described overwhelming anxiety. Several said they felt trapped in their own thoughts. Hour after hour, day after day, with nowhere to escape. Researchers studying isolation noticed similar patterns. Long periods without normal social contact could affect mood, attention, sleep, and emotional stability. The effects varied from person to person. Some adapted better than others. Some struggled much more. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. Isolation changes people. Inside Red Onion, the effects were not always visible. There were no dramatic warning signs. No flashing alarms. No obvious indicators. The changes often happened slowly. So slowly that people sometimes failed to notice them. Until the damage had already begun. A former correctional officer once explained it this way. You don't see isolation working in a day. You see it working in years. Years. That was the key word. Because many inmates stayed in restrictive housing for long periods. And the longer the isolation lasted, the more questions people began asking. What happens when a person spends years without meaningful human interaction? Can the brain remain healthy? Can relationships survive? Can identity survive? The answers were becoming increasingly complicated. Meanwhile, Red Onion continued operating. Every day followed familiar patterns. Security checks, meals, controlled movement, structured schedules. From an administrative perspective, the system functioned. Violence remained relatively low. Order remained relatively high. Supporters argued that proved the model worked. But critics pointed to another issue. What was the true cost of that order? The debate expanded beyond Virginia. Across America, people began questioning Supermax prisons. Experts testified before lawmakers. Researchers published studies. Civil rights organizations raised concerns. Correctional officials defended their policies. Both sides believed they were protecting society. Yet they disagreed about how that protection should happen. The discussion became national. Red Onion found itself at the center of it. Television documentaries featured former inmates. Newspapers published investigations. Academic researchers analyzed prison conditions. Public interest grew. The prison that few people had heard about was suddenly attracting attention from across the country. And attention brought scrutiny. One issue generated particular concern: mental health. Many prisons house individuals already dealing with emotional and psychological challenges. Isolation, critics argued, could make those challenges worse. Supporters responded that Red Onion provided mental health services and followed established procedures. The debate continued. Neither side fully convinced the other. But public curiosity kept growing. People wanted to know what daily life actually looked like. They wanted to know what happened behind the walls. What did inmates do all day? How did they spend their time? How did they cope? The answers varied. Some prisoners read books. Some exercised inside their cells. Some wrote letters. Some studied educational materials. Others simply waited. Waited for meals. Waited for recreation. Waited for visits. Waited for tomorrow. And then another tomorrow. And another. The waiting became part of life. For some inmates, family contact became a lifeline. Letters from loved ones offered reminders that the outside world still existed. Phone calls became important moments. Visits became treasured opportunities. Yet maintaining relationships from inside a Supermax prison was difficult. Distance created obstacles. Rules created obstacles. Time created obstacles. Families often struggled too. Parents, children, spouses, brothers, sisters. Everyone felt the effects. The prison's influence extended far beyond its walls. And that influence sometimes lasted long after incarceration ended. Former inmates described unexpected challenges following release. Crowded places felt overwhelming. Simple conversations felt exhausting. Everyday decisions became stressful. Some needed months or years to readjust. Others never fully felt comfortable again. Researchers studying re-entry found similar patterns. The skills required to survive extreme isolation were often very different from the skills needed to function in normal society. Adaptation inside prison could become a disadvantage outside prison. This realization created another difficult question. If incarceration is meant to prepare people for eventual release, what happens when the prison environment itself makes adjustment harder? Again, there were no simple answers. Only more debate, more research, more questions, and more stories. Then came a development that intensified scrutiny even further. Several advocacy groups requested greater transparency regarding conditions inside restrictive housing units. They wanted more information, more oversight, more public accountability. Some lawmakers supported those efforts. Others opposed them. The issue became increasingly political. Red Onion was no longer just a prison. It had become a symbol. To supporters, it represented safety and control. To critics, it represented the dangers of prolonged isolation. Both sides pointed to evidence. Both sides believed they were right. And while the arguments continued, something unexpected happened. A new review began examining years of data from Red Onion and other high-security facilities. Researchers hoped to understand whether long-term isolation actually improved outcomes. The findings would become some of the most important information ever released about Supermax prisons. Officials waited. Advocates waited. Families waited. The results had the potential to reshape prison policy across America. Because if the data supported isolation, supporters would feel vindicated. But if the data raised serious concerns, pressure for reform could become impossible to ignore. Months passed. The review continued. The public heard very little. Then finally, the first findings began to emerge. And what investigators discovered would challenge assumptions that had existed for decades. The future of Red Onion State Prison was about to face its greatest test. The walls of Red Onion were built to contain people. But the biggest question was whether they were containing problems or creating new ones. The findings arrived after years of research. Prison officials read them. Lawmakers read them. Advocates read them. Families read them. And suddenly, the debate surrounding Red Onion became impossible to ignore. For decades, Supermax prisons had been built around a simple belief. Isolation creates safety. Separate dangerous inmates. Reduce contact. Reduce conflict. Reduce risk. On paper, the logic seemed straightforward. And in some ways, it worked. Red Onion experienced very few large-scale disturbances. There were no major prison takeovers. No organized gang activity spreading through housing units. No prison-wide riots dominating national headlines. Supporters pointed to those facts immediately. To them, the system had achieved exactly what it was designed to do: control, order, security. But the new research asked a different question. Not whether the prison maintained order, whether the long-term effects justified the cost. And that question opened a door nobody could easily close. Researchers discovered that prolonged isolation often created challenges that followed inmates long after they left restrictive housing. Some struggled socially. Some struggled emotionally. Some found it difficult to rebuild normal relationships. Others experienced anxiety in crowded environments. The findings did not suggest every inmate reacted the same way. Human beings are different. Some adapted better than others. Some remained resilient despite years of confinement. but the overall pattern was difficult to dismiss. Long-term isolation left lasting marks. Marks that could not be seen from security cameras. Marks that existed beneath the surface. As these discussions spread, pressure for reform began growing. Virginia officials started reviewing prison policies. Advocacy groups called for change. Mental health experts provided testimony. Former inmates shared their experiences publicly. The conversation was no longer limited to Red Onion. It had become part of a nationwide debate. What should prisons actually accomplish? Punishment? Deterrence? Rehabilitation? Public safety? Could one institution achieve all four? Or did pursuing one goal sometimes undermine another? No one agreed completely. Yet change was coming. Gradually, prison administrators began examining alternatives. Some programs focused on reducing isolation for certain inmates. Others emphasized behavior-based systems that allowed prisoners to earn increased privileges. The goal was not to eliminate security. The goal was to balance security with opportunities for progress. It was a difficult balance. One mistake could have serious consequences. One successful reform could improve countless lives. Every decision carried weight. Meanwhile, inside Red Onion, life continued. The steel doors still closed. The routines still operated. The schedules still controlled each day. But something had changed. People were paying attention. For years, Red Onion had existed largely outside public awareness. Now journalists, researchers, and policymakers were watching closely. Transparency increased. Questions increased. Accountability increased. The prison was no longer hidden from public discussion. And that visibility mattered. Because prisons often operate far from public view. Most people never see the inside of a Supermax facility. Most people never hear the sounds, never feel the atmosphere, never witness the routines. Yet those institutions remain part of society. The decisions made inside them affect real people, inmates, officers, families, communities, everyone. As the years passed, Red Onion continued evolving. Programs expanded, policies changed, reviews continued. Some reforms moved slowly. Others moved more quickly. Supporters of the prison argued that security must always come first. Critics argued that security alone could never be enough. The truth, many experts believed, probably existed somewhere between those positions. Because Red Onion's story was never simple. It was not a story of heroes and villains. It was not a story of easy answers. It was a story about competing responsibilities. Protecting society, maintaining order, respecting human dignity, preparing people for the future. Those goals sometimes worked together. Sometimes they conflicted. And prisons had to navigate those conflicts every day. One former officer explained it best. People think prisons are about locks and walls. They're really about decisions. Every policy is a decision. Every rule is a decision. Every housing assignment is a decision. And those decisions shape lives. For inmates, the consequences are obvious. For officers, the consequences can be equally significant. Correctional staff spend years working in environments defined by tension, routine, and constant vigilance. Many officers describe the work as challenging. Some describe it as rewarding. Others describe it as exhausting. Like inmates, they are affected by the institution around them. Red Onion influences everyone inside its walls. That reality often gets overlooked. The prison is more than a building. It is an environment, an ecosystem, a system that affects every person who enters it. And perhaps that is why the debate continues today. Because Red Onion represents something larger than itself. It represents a question America still struggles to answer. How should society handle individuals considered dangerous? The answer seems obvious at first. Keep them secure. Protect the public. Maintain order. But once those goals are achieved, another question appears. Then what? What comes next? What is the purpose of confinement beyond containment? Should every prisoner be given a path toward improvement? Can every prisoner change? Should some prisoners remain isolated indefinitely? Where should society draw the line? These questions remain unresolved. Different people offer different answers. Different states follow different approaches. Different nations follow different philosophies. The debate continues because the stakes are enormous. Public safety matters. Human dignity matters. Justice matters. And balancing those priorities is never easy. Today, Red Onion State Prison still stands among the mountains of Virginia. The concrete walls remain. The steel doors remain. The security systems remain. Yet the conversation surrounding the prison continues evolving. Researchers continue studying confinement. Officials continue reviewing policies. Advocates continue raising concerns. Supporters continue defending the institution's role. The discussion is far from over, and perhaps it never will be, because the story of Red Onion is not really about one prison. It is about the larger question hidden behind every prison wall. What happens when security becomes the highest priority? How much isolation is too much? How much control is necessary? And what responsibilities remain after a person has been contained? Those questions have no simple answers, but they matter, because prisons are ultimately reflections of the societies that build them. The choices made inside Red Onion reveal what people fear, what they value, what they hope to prevent, and what they are willing to accept. For some, Red Onion represents safety. For others, it represents caution. For many, it represents both. The prison was built to isolate the most difficult inmates in the system. It succeeded in that mission. But in doing so, it forced a larger conversation about punishment, rehabilitation, and human resilience. A conversation that continues today. And perhaps that is the real legacy of Red Onion State Prison. Not the walls, not the doors, not the security measures, but the questions it leaves behind. Questions about justice. Questions about humanity. Questions about what happens when a society decides that containment alone is not enough. Because long after the steel doors close, those questions remain. And unlike the inmates inside Red Onion, they cannot be locked away.